The Cayman Islands is the 5th largest financial center in the world. It hosts 80,000 registered companies, over 3/4 of the world's hedge funds, and $1.9 trillion in deposits. It has a population of 60,000, roughly equivalent to New York's homeless population. A strange mixture of characters populate the offshore world. British ex-public schoolboys, members of the world's intelligence services, global criminals, assorted lords and ladies, and bankers galore. With so much at stake for so many wealthy and powerful individuals, it may come as no surprise that Britain's offshore havens have developed their own curious mechanisms to prevent information from leaking out.
For many people who work offshore and who don't like what they're doing, it's very hard indeed to dissent, because they will be attacked personally with a degree of viciousness which is quite extraordinary. Most of the time the instruments of suppression are relatively sophisticated. You won't get promotion by doing this, or your family won't like it.
It's not generally, let's slam them in prison. That's far too crude. We are talking about very substantially, the establishment, the British establishment in these cases. The mechanisms are very, very subtle. Sort of ostracism is one way of doing it. These peculiar mechanisms for, if someone tries to blow the whistle, you find all sorts of methods that aren't the most, just fire them, you give them far too much work to do, you steer them in a different direction.
One person who is intimately familiar with how suppression works offshore is former Jersey Senator and Health Minister Stuart Sivray. In 2009, he leaked a report on a rogue nurse suspected of killing patients at Jersey's hospital.
It all came to a head during a state's debate on Tuesday the 10th of March. Senator Stuart Sivray brought the sitting to a standstill, claiming Senator Jimmy Pershard had sworn at him and told him to go and top himself. Senator Pershard denied the claim, saying, "I absolutely refute that." But less than a week later, he was forced to admit he had lied. Senator Pershard has now admitted that on another occasion he did tell Senator Stuart Sivray to go and do everyone a favour and slit his wrists.
I was arrested at my house one morning by 6 plainclothes police officers. There were another 2 specialist data search police officers on hand, and also another 2 police officers in full body armour of one of those battering rams they kind of use in drugs raids. So 10 police officers descended on me without a search warrant. The property was turned over from top to bottom. All of the computers were seized and searched. All kinds of private constituency data was stolen by the police.
Shortly after we began filming, a police officer exited the police station. As he hurried past, he grinned at the camera. The officer was on his way to test the sirens on his motorbike, which he did at intervals throughout much of the remainder of the interview.
When it came to prosecuting me,
Stuart Sivray was prosecuted under the data protection law.
Now, when the authorities were prosecuting me, I claimed that this was a legitimate public interest disclosure defence, and I, with an expert witness, was able to produce a set of reports that effectively destroyed the prosecution case.
In reaction to this, the magistrates ruled that Stuart Sivray's defence case, that he had leaked the report in the public interest, would no longer be admissible, but continued to prosecute him all the same, without a defence case. Over the past 7 years, Stuart Sivray has been repeatedly taken to court and imprisoned 3 times. He does not know when or if the persecution will end, nor does he know when he will find himself behind bars again.
To look at Jersey from the outside, it looks like it's got a prosecution system, it looks like it's got a court and a legislature, but none of it's real. It's a Potemkin village. None of these systems in Jersey meet the tests of being objective or actually functioning properly.
The experience that Stuart Sivray had is, he's perhaps at the blunter end of the scale. He was simply suppressed and taken to court on trumped-up charges.
Let's carry on pretending to do the interview. They might get bored. This is the kind of how oppression happens in Jersey. You see, all kinds of little things get done to harass people. Even they don't often go to the kind of extremes that they did against me in terms of actually arresting me and putting me in prison. But the authorities use all kinds of other lesser little methods to interfere with people, kind of sabotage things, obstruct people, make life difficult for people. If you annoy the establishment in Jersey, you won't get a job here. Your children won't get decent jobs. That's kind of how it works.
I went to Jersey in March 2009 with Nick Shackson. About 24 hours after we arrived in Jersey, we were there for several days. Nick said, "Did you know that? Have you noticed that we're being followed? Ever since we arrived at the airport, we've been followed." He said, "Don't look now, but we're being followed now." Turns out he was quite correct. We were being followed. And I found that very disturbing indeed.
They have a saying in Jersey, if you don't like it here, there's always a boat in the morning. Jersey Finance promotional literature states, Jersey represents an extension of the City of London.
It's where the City of London chooses to do many of the activities which they couldn't do in London itself.
We're here just to talk about this one company called Appleby. I'll just read what they say on their website. Members of the firm, Appleby, have gone on not only to political office, but also in a number of centres, Bermuda, Jersey, the Isle of Man and the Cayman Islands, to senior judicial office. So essentially, they're boasting of the fact that their staff and their partners have a real interchange between the people that are in power in these offshore financial centres.
The same lawyers and accountants who set up and administer offshore trusts also occupy senior political positions. In Britain's offshore world, most politicians are in business. They lobby for business and promote business interests. They draft, refine, and pass legislation. Politicians sit on the boards of the companies they are supposed to regulate.
There is no place for dirty money in Britain. Indeed, there should be no place for dirty money anywhere. The challenge I'm laying down for every country today is to root out the rot of corruption, to ensure transparency over what your own companies are doing, require transparency for foreign companies in your country too, and work with us to spread this approach to transparency around the world.
In public, British politicians claim they are cracking down on secrecy jurisdictions and corruption. But in practice, they do the opposite.
When I talk to politicians in Brussels, they say that they've had more lobbyists from London, and including politicians, come to them to protect the City of London's interests than they've had from every other European member state combined, which gives you some idea of the extent to which British politicians see themselves as essentially lobbyists for the City of London.
We begin with our big story. Cayman's efforts to ensure transparency in its financial services sector is being recognised by the international community. Earlier this week, the UK's Prime Minister David Cameron told Parliament that the tax haven label placed on its crown dependencies and overseas territories is unfair.
Many British politicians have personal and business ties with the City of London and British secrecy jurisdictions. Former British Prime Minister David Cameron's father, Ian Cameron, was an expert in offshore funds and was involved in offshore trusts from the 1980s onwards.
At this courthouse behind me here in St Helier, we found this. It's a document called a grant of probate, and it's attached to the English will of none other than Ian Cameron, David Cameron's father.
Say hello to Mum and Dad.
Hi, Bar, how are you? Good to see you. Ian Cameron was certainly a wealthy man. In 2009, his personal fortune was estimated by researchers for the Sunday Times Rich List at £10 million. Yet when Ian Cameron died in 2010, his estate was much smaller than might be expected, just £2.7 million.
In many cases, it's the politicians and their cronies and their families and so on, and the business people who sponsor the political parties, who are using these offshore services themselves. So they've got no personal interest in closing it down. If they wanted to close it down, they could do it tomorrow. The fact of the matter is they don't want to do it because they themselves are complicit with the process.
If you come from the same kind of background, you know the right people, then all the kind of legal niceties will often fall away. You can get away with doing all sorts of things that they wouldn't just let any old person, you know, if you came knocking on the door saying, can you set up an offshore company to do this, they'd tell you to get lost. But if you're part of the networks, you can do these kinds of things. So that's a very important part of the whole system. Upper class British public school kind of establishment that has been there since, you know, for centuries.
The British establishment, an old boys' network of privileged elites, had carved out a lucrative niche for themselves in the offshore world after the demise of empire. They transformed themselves from administrators of empire into financial handlers for the global elite and multinational corporations. As more money flowed offshore, societies around the globe began to feel the impact of the offshore world.
The reality is not what you believe, that your prime minister has the power to decide on the future of your country. The power is hidden here.
We have country after country around the world where the lack of financial transparency about taxation, about ownership, about corruption has undermined the extent to which governments deliver representative policy making for their citizens. You know, we have extreme cases like the hiding of tax evasion by people in finance ministries in Greece, in France, but we also have this system that in general is geared towards anonymous company ownership, the anonymous ownership of properties across London, of half of the land in Scotland. You know, do we really think there's any circumstances in which governments work better, in which markets work better, in which the distribution of income and assets is better, when we allow so much to be hidden? Who wants to not know who you're doing business with? Who wants their government to have people working for it, or to be led by people whose assets are hidden, whose financial transactions are conducted anonymously offshore? You know, this is a bad direction for the world.
We need the citizens to understand what is happening, that they are the ones who is carrying the burden, and that some individuals having the power are exonerating themselves. Ordinary people are paying taxes, rich people are not. So this is inequality, and it is leading up to populism, because it shows so clearly that the people today leading the world are not able to take care of the interest of ordinary people.
Back in the 60s and 70s, you know, tax evasion or pushing back against taxation, it was kind of seen as anti-establishment. So, you know, the Rolling Stones and Phil Collins, all these people kind of going offshore, going away, it was seen as a sort of rebellious thing to do. And if you fast forward to the present day, now that is the establishment. The offshore system is the establishment.
Today, offshore is the way elites and multinational corporations conduct their affairs. Tax evasion is the way business is done.
This kind of sophisticated cheating requires a huge infrastructure. We like to talk about the pinstripe infrastructure of highly educated people who think it is their right to help others to cheat societies.
We have a new mafia in town. It does not actually shoot people, does not put bullets in their kneecaps, but its trade is just as deadly. It deprives people of opportunities to have healthcare, education, security, justice, and essentially a fulfilling life.
Accountants form the backbone of the offshore system. They administer the structures that allow individuals and corporations to shift their money offshore and evade taxes.
There are about 2.5 million professionally qualified accountants on this planet. About 330,000 are in the UK.
Well-known people, well-dressed, well-fed, highly paid, are sitting in city centre offices, and they are paid to dream up tax avoidance schemes for individuals and for corporations.
We can all elect a government which says, vote for us, we will give you better healthcare, better education, better security. And next day accountants say, sorry about that folks, you elected this government, but we actually got a tax avoidance scheme, and the Amazons and the Googles and Microsofts won't be paying any taxes in your jurisdiction. Too bad you voted for it, but actually you're going to get something else.
So it's a crazy world that part of the business model at big accountancy firms is how to deny public the services by erosion of tax revenues. And these firms are then rewarded with government-funded contracts, and the same firms are then advising local governments and the central governments, and the same firms then report on the company accounts and tell us all is well.
When I argue this with a Pricewaterhouse partner in a face-to-face debate, he said, Professor Sikka, you never give us credit for anything. We generate millions of dollars of revenues, and we have lots and lots of satisfied clients. What is your problem? And my response was very simple. That's the language of drug pushers and pimps.
In Britain, a new breed of civil servant was rising to the top. One such civil servant was Dave Hartnett, who rose to the top of HMRC, the UK tax authority. Dave Hartnett had a new way of collecting tax. Deals would be negotiated on an individual basis, behind closed doors. In the case of the largest clients, Dave Hartnett frequently led the negotiations himself. British Telecom was one of the first companies through the programme and received a refund of over £1 billion. BT's chief executive, Ben Verweyen, wrote, "Earnings per share up 14%. And nice to know that we have a £1 billion credit from the taxman." Dave Hartnett claimed this approach was more efficient.
Litigation in the courts is really phenomenally expensive in this day and age all over the world, and I think is to be avoided where possible. And the art is to persuade people to pay by strength of argument and the like.
After protests erupted in 2011, the Treasury Select Committee questioned Dave Hartnett. Dave Hartnett claimed he could not give any information due to taxpayer confidentiality.
What in statute prevents you from disclosing information to Parliament?
All my advice, Mr. Barclay, so far has been that I am prevented, and my colleagues are prevented, by the Act and by the decision of the Commissioners.
Dave Hartnett failed to mention that the legal advice he had received stated that the disclosure of information was at the discretion of the head of HMRC. The head of HMRC was Dave Hartnett himself.
Just like the mafia has penetrated the state, accountancy firms have also penetrated the state. At the head of anti-avoidance in the UK, tax authority is from one of these firms. The newly appointed chairman of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is a tax authority, is a partner from KPMG. Their partners have penetrated the state. They are running the Treasury.
Britain's financial services industry had penetrated the state and began to shape its laws for its own benefit.
The degree of political capture by the City of London, by the big banks and the big law firms, is so enormous that the politicians have effectively become their spokespersons.
With the government unwilling to act in the interest of the public, a group of protesters confronted Dave Hartnett at a private event in Oxford.
Hi everybody, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to take a few moments of your time. Here tonight to present Dave with an award. It is the Lifetime Achievement Award for services to corporate tax planning.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dave's been a great friend to the industry, a great friend to many of us over the years, and really we just can't thank him enough for what he's done.
Obviously us at Vodafone, it saved us billions off our tax bill, and our friends at Goldman Sachs as well, we've also saved us millions as well.
25 million or so.
These people are trespassers and intruders.
And I know you've had problems with those pesky
This is an unlawful conspiracy to trespass. And you will go, sir. You will depart immediately before we set the dogs on you. Go. You're trespassing. Okay.
Sorry.
You are trespassing, scum. Go.
After his retirement, Dave Hartnett moved to the private sector. One of his positions was at accountancy firm Deloitte, where he advises foreign governments on corporate taxation. Dave Hartnett is a companion of the Order of the Bath, an honour bestowed on him by the British monarch.
We have former ministers acting as advisors to accountancy firms. Accountancy firms provide jobs and consultancies for potential ministers. To my mind, really, it's an indication of corrupt structures. People are buying and selling influences. When a former minister works for an accountancy firm, he's not providing any accounting knowledge. He's opening political opportunities, home and abroad. That is what they are doing.
I hope by now you'll share my view that I don't trust most bankers, I don't trust most lawyers, I don't trust most accounting firms. I actually think they're engaged in a conspiracy against public interest.
In Britain, secrecy and complexity in finance and government help to obscure corruption in public office. Financial structures are often so complex that even after they are publicly revealed, they are not widely recognized for what they are. An example of this is PFI, the Private Finance Initiative.
PFI is Private Finance Initiative. It is a way of funding public infrastructure, things like hospitals, schools, roads and bridges, but financing them via the private sector rather than the historical method, which is via central government. Over a period of 30 or 40 years, the amount of kind of repayment costs will be sort of 3 or 4 times higher overall than if you borrowed it from central government in the first place. So it's basically a giant accounting scam. Once the PFI policy has been set up, you find that the big 4 accountancy firms were actually paid members of staff within the Treasury Department who were then actually going around and selling and advising upon the implementation of PFI contracts by public authorities.
Effectively saying, come to us and we will show you how to derive the most benefit from it. In other words, how to perhaps exploit the legislation.
Even the offices of the state tax authority are now owned offshore. HMRC, which is the tax collector here in the UK, their offices are owned in Bermuda by a company called Mapley Steps. It's quite incredible.
The company that owns the PFI contract to run HMRC's head office borrowed money from offshore investors at 15% interest. Because the interest was so high, the company was losing money. Therefore, it did not pay tax. In 2011, HMRC could not prove that any PFI company was paying any tax in the UK.
I think we need to have a serious conversation about the role of government in this whole debacle and how much our government has been penetrated by big banks and accountancy firms, and ultimately in whose interest it operates. The reason we were protesting outside the Africa PPP conference is that we wanted to make sure that citizens back in Africa should hear about the fact that such policies have been a complete failure here in the UK. We know that these products are not being marketed to African countries in their own best interests. Their only motivation is to spread the reach of financial services into new markets. It's all being promoted in the interest of the City of London. What you're seeing is basically a second form of colonialisation. You've had initially occupation, resource extraction, and through that process, countries like Britain, which have had a large offshore empire, have developed significant networks, and now those networks are being used to promote and exploit financial services.
The City of London was the beating financial heart of the British Empire. As Britain's empire declined, the city transformed itself from a hub operating the financial machinery of empire into a global financial centre. Former insignificant outposts of empire became the basis for a spider's web of offshore secrecy jurisdictions that captured wealth from across the globe and funneled it to the City of London. Today, 25% of international finance is conducted on British territory. Almost half of the world's secrecy jurisdictions are under British protection. Up to half of all offshore wealth may be hidden in Britain's offshore havens. Financial services is how Britain's elites make their money. And it is also where former government ministers, senior civil servants and retired spooks from MI5 and MI6 receive lucrative consulting positions after their time in public service. Together they have transformed Britain and its dependencies into the world's largest tax haven, harming development throughout the world and turning Britain itself into a country that serves, above all, the interests of its elites.